Hello everybody, it's James, and on behalf of Neptic Fathers, I'm going to be bringing you all another book review. And today I'm going to be talking about Gregory Palamas, The Hesychast, Controversy, and the Debate with Islam, documents relating to Gregory Palamas by Norman Russell. So this book here is a fantastic primary source reference book. It's not a cheap book by any stretch of the imagination, but it is fantastic, and I highly recommend it to anybody interested in the Hesychast controversy. So it introduces for the first time in English documents relating to the Hesychast controversy and details about St. Gregory's life and some of his apologetical talks. The main text is 447 pages and has a glossary in the back and a list of patristic citations, which is beneficial in case if you want to cross-reference the patristic citations. It also includes well-documented sources with a ton of important footnotes, and I've used that extensively to try to find other books for further research. And this book also contains a wealth of information important for Orthodox Christianity, especially dogmatic statements, because some of the texts in this book are actually considered a part of the Ninth Ecumenical Council, which I'll get into later in the video. And so I was able to glean over 35 pages of notes, and I was able to take notes with my commonplace book here. And 35 pages of notes, and even the notes that I've taken 35 pages are just, it's just like information dense, dogmatic declarations and statements. And I highly recommend, I highly recommend this book. So 35 pages of notes, and I'll try to go over some of that in this video. The book has so much information in the 35 pages of notes that I've taken that it would be hard to actually cover everything in one video. Okay, so in addition to my 35 pages of notes, Norman Russell has 35 pages of a general introduction to the life and writings of St. Gregory in this volume, and I also think that it's a very good 35-page introduction. I appreciate the fact that it's a 35-page introduction to like 400 and some odd pages of main content, as opposed to some books that you get, and it'll be like maybe the main translation of the work is 70 pages, but the introduction is like 250 pages, and you got to wade through a 250-page introduction in order to get to the thing that you actually wanted to read. But this is a great 35-page general introduction, which is, to me, quite great. And in this volume, The Full Life of St. Gregory Palamas by Philotheos Kokkinos is translated for the first time into English. And this biography was written within 10 years of the death of St. Gregory by Philotheos, who was Patriarch of Constantinople. This life is quite lengthy at over 150 pages and includes the time from his youth until the time of his death, with approximate years at which the events take place. It also includes details about his family life and the time when he was taken captive by the Turks and held for ransom. So this book also contains the synodal tomes, which codify a decision of a holy synod or a council of Orthodox bishops. And so the synodal tomes that are included in this book are the synodal tomes of 1341, 1347, 1351, and 1368. And for the tomes of 1347, they include two different synods. One's an Orthodox synod from that year, and the other's from the anti-Palamite synod of the same year. So the synods of 1341, 1347, and 1351 comprise the Ninth Ecumenical Council for the Orthodox. So, and also during the 1351 Council, and that's one of the things that I found by reading this book, the 1351 Council, they scrutinized the works of St. Gregory Palamas that had been written up until that time point, and they were approved in that council. So the Ninth Ecumenical Council for the Orthodox approves up to 1351 approves the writings of St. Gregory. So one of the books that would be included in that list is here, St. Gregory Palamas's the triads. In this translation here, I did a previous video where I reviewed that book. And so here we have in this book talking about the writings of St. Gregory, and that they are approved and that they are good for study and for theology. And so I highly recommend getting both books, and especially trying to buy up or get a copy of the triads where they are available. And currently, the hardback of that triads is sold out, but they have the paperback still now back on the website for Newfound Publishing, I think what it is. Yes, Newfound Publishing, and Father Peter is the translator. So also the book contains 50 pages of personal letters, and these letters contain theological discussions, so it's not just kind of like a keeping up with somebody and, some like personal biographical details, but these are like theological letters that are written to other people. And this book also includes over 25 pages of his apologetic debates with Muslims and a defense of orthodoxy. It was during the time of his captivity with the Turks that he was actually able to put these together, and these are recorded in this book. In particular, St. Gregory's letter to Empress Anna Paleologina happens to be a very good summary of the Hesychast controversy. So in this book, it has that letter, and so if you want a quick read of more or less the main ideas and stuff behind what's going on with the Hesychast controversy, you can read that letter. So during the Hesychast controversy, St. Gregory and those in favor of the Orthodox position refuted a number of individuals with multiple influences. Some were Byzantine Neoplatonists, others were influenced by Western Scholasticism, and others were against St. Gregory and the Hesychast for political reasons. Russell mentions in his introduction that Barlaam is now believed to be influenced by Byzantine Neoplatonism rather than Western Scholasticism. There's a lot of books that you read about Barlaam. It'll talk about how he was a Western scholastic or influenced by Western Scholasticism, even though he was from Calabria and that area spoke Greek, or he would have grown up knowing Greek. During the course of the Ninth Ecumenical Council, a number of individuals were anathematized for heretical teachings, which this book covers in detail, and these anathemas were entered into the Synodicon of Orthodoxy. The main anti-Palamites include Barlaam, Akindynos, Patriarch John Kokkinos, Nikephoros Gregoras, and Prochoros. As I mentioned, there's a hardcover version, and it's quite expensive. It's $135 to $175. So I've seen it kind of vary between those two price points, but a paperback version is available for $59.99. I'd recommend this book to anybody interested in St. Gregory and the Hesychast controversy, Orthodox apologists who are interested in his debate with Islam, and also anybody interested in kind of the essence-energies distinction and the defense of essence-energy distinction against, say, like the Western Catholic view. And also it gets into some stuff with the difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, because during this time point, there's filtering into Byzantium, into Constantinople, works by Catholics such as Thomas Aquinas. So anybody interested in those nuances and those differences of Catholic dogmas and Orthodox dogmas as well, can find a definitely valuable resource in this text. Also, I should say our views on grace as well could be added to the stuff that's talked about in this book, because it gets into the created grace, or if grace is like divine, and grace is an energy of God. So that's also covered in this book as well. So a short information on some of the people that are in this, covered in this book. They're the people that are basically condemned. So Barlaam is the first one that we encounter, and Barlaam was born and raised in Calabria around the year of 1290. He was Orthodox by birth, and he was a monk of the Basilian monastery of St. Elias in Calabria, where he was ordained to the priesthood. And he came to the Greek East in about the year 1325. In this book, Russell writes, quote, "Older scholarship tended to see Barlaam as a Westernizer imbued with the spirit of the Italian Renaissance, but more recently it has been established that it had been formed in a Byzantine Neoplatonic tradition, much in the manner of Theodore Metochites and Nikephoros Gregoras, end quote. Russell goes on to write, quote, from Thessaloniki, he went on to Constantinople, where he impressed John Cantacozinos and the Emperor Andronicos III by his learning and his expertise in dialectic, especially in a debate with Latin envoys of Pope John XXII on the procession of the Holy Spirit. Some may have seen him as abrasive and ambitious, but that did not prevent him from becoming an important member of Constantinople's intellectual elite, end quote. Andronicos III ended up sending Barlaam in 1339 on a confidential mission to Philip VI of France and Pope Benedict XII to ask for military aid against the Turks. When he returned from his mission to Paris and Avignon, he published his attack against the Hesychast, titled Against the Massalians. And I should note that also in this book contains some information about the Bogomils, just like a brief mention of them. And it's interesting to me to kind of start diving into this stuff about like the Bogomils and the Massalians during this time period, because this is the time period that we have for the Proto-Protestants. So guys like John Huss, Wycliffe, see also, I mean, even not too much longer from now, we get actually Martin Luther. But guys like John Huss and Wycliffe are actually influenced by what is like the more essentially like the Bogomils and the Massalians, and there's some interesting scholarship coming out of some of the Eastern European countries where this where like the Bogomils originated from, that compare the doctrines of the Bogomils with those of like Proto-Protestants, because the Proto-Protestants were obviously very against the Catholic Church. They were against relics and the intercession of saints and stuff like this. And when you look at historical versions of Christianity that have claimed apostolic succession, like the Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox, or the Oriental Orthodox as they're otherwise known, all venerate saints. They all have relics. And it's interesting to find that at the same time period that you get these Proto-Protestants, you get the Bogomils, and the Bogomils are against the veneration of saints, against the intercession of the saints. And it's interesting to also note that the Bogomils, or some of these dualist sects that are in Europe at the time, actually have very similar doctrines to the Proto-Protestants, and similar translations also, or the exact same translations of certain passages of Scripture. So some of the scholarship that's coming out now links basically these dualist sects and the Proto-Protestants. So obviously not all Proto-Protestants are going to have the exact doctrine of the Bogomils, because they take some stuff from Catholicism. But just a side note, that's an interesting thing to maybe study in your own time, because I haven't had time to study it yet and be able to do a documentary or any video discussing it. But I have picked up some few books about like the Cathars and stuff like that. But this book does briefly talk about the Bogomils. Okay, so going back to Barlaam, Barlaam did not differentiate between the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the created world. He believed that both could be gained through philosophy instead of the knowledge of God coming directly by revelation. So Russell writes, quote, Barlaam held that because truth is one, insofar as the pagan philosophers had attained to truth, they too, like the church fathers, had been illuminated by God. Palamas is shocked by this. In his view, the two kinds of illumination are not comparable. True theologians arrive at a knowledge of God through participation in divine glory. The rulers of apologetic and dialectic reasoning belong to a different level of knowledge altogether. What Barlaam is trying to do is to turn debating techniques and intellectual analysis into ultimate truth. End quote. So with Barlaam's doctrine, a lot of people, I think, still today kind of have that mindset, and a lot of Protestants, for example, will have kind of that same sort of mindset that Barlaam used to have. So St. Gregory's second opponent in the Hesychast controversy was Akindynos, who had once been St. Gregory's friend. Akindynos' main objection to the Hesychast position was against the essence-energy distinction in God. Russell writes, quote, "Unlike Barlaam, Akindynos was not a philosopher. He was a monk from a humble background, Greek, not Slavonic, as is often claimed, who had acquired a good education at the renowned school of Thomas Magistros in Thessaloniki. Deeply immersed in the fathers of the church, he turned against Palamas because he believed that the man he had once admired so strongly was manipulating the patristic tradition to support theological innovations. Indeed, much of the controversy turned on the correct exegesis of a number of key patristic texts. These were the divine names of Dionysius the Areopagite against Eunomius, and letter 234 of Basil of Caesarea, the theological orations of Gregory of Nazianzus, the Ambigua of Maximus the Confessor, and the homilies on the Transfiguration of St. Andrew of Crete and St. John Damascene. Drawing on these and other texts, Palamas argues that to insist on an unqualified divine simplicity removes God from human experience. We cannot know what God is, his essence, but we experience him in what God does, his energies. For Akindynos, however, God can only be known symbolically or by inference from what he has created. The debate came to focus on the exegesis of the Transfiguration. What was it that the apostles saw? For Palamas, it was the uncreated glory of God shining through Christ's humanity, which will illuminate all who have attained the likeness of Christ. Yet because this glory was accessible to the senses, although divine, it was not the same as the divine essence. For Akindynos, the light seen by the apostles on Mount Tabor belonged simply to Christ's humanity, therefore it created grace." End quote. Other Byzantine Neoplatonists were opponents of the Hesychasts, one of whom was Nikephoros Gregoras. Russell writes, quote, "Nikephoros Gregoras had been, like Palamas, a pupil of Theodore Methokites, but whereas Palamas had not gone very far beyond the study of Aristotle, Gregoras had imbibed deeply from Neoplatonic sources. The incomprehensibility of God is absolute for him. Even sensible things elude our grasp of their essence. Therefore, Palamas's claim that we can participate in the life of God through the gift of grace, a gift which is nothing less than God himself in an active mode, is utterly unacceptable to Gregoras. The only source of true knowledge is what Gregoras calls the motionless movement of the mind. The mind's knowledge of itself is the real path to wisdom. The sensory impressions of the light of Tabor produce mental images, nothing more. These images must be seen as symbols, which are not in themselves reality, but can assist the mind to ascend to reality, which is the mind's knowledge of itself, where God is ultimately to be found." End quote. Russell goes on to write, quote, "Palamas declared after his vindication by the Council of 1347 that the essence of his dispute with Barlaam lay in their conflicting assessments of the ability of grace to deify, to raise the believer to participation in the divine. This, for Palamas, following Maximus the Confessor, was the purpose of the Incarnation, the purpose of the Christian life. By extension was therefore communion with God in his fullness, a communion which can begin by grace even in this life. Grace deifies because grace is the Holy Spirit himself in action, who first brings about the divine rebirth of baptism, and then enables the believer by the imitation of Christ to partake of God, a partaking which is nothing less than union with God. But union cannot take place with the hypostasis of God, or through the merging of the divine and human essences. Hypostatic union with the Father belongs to the Son alone. Logically, then, if essential and hypostatic union are excluded, what remains is union with the divine energy, with grace in action. Those like Akindynos, who deny that union on this level was the purpose of the Incarnation, deprive us of salvation in terms of deification. The barrier that Akindynos raised between humanity and God by equating the energies with the Son and the Spirit, or by denying them altogether, was the reason for the confirmation of his earlier condemnation by the Council of 1351. End quote. In the latter parts of the 1300s, the influence of Western scholasticism was starting to trickle into Constantinople. It was around 1355 that Thomas Aquinas' Summa contra Gentiles was translated into Greek and became influential. The influence of Western scholastic works in Orthodox circles led to the rekindling of the Hesychast controversy. He assisted his brother with the translation of a number of works, including some portions of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, as well as other works by Augustine, Boethius, and Aquinas. At the Lavra, partially under the influence of the Latin works he was translating, Prochoros became strongly opposed to Palamite theology. As a result, he attracted the intense hostility of other members of his community. Russell writes, quote, "When a council was convened in April 1368 to hear Prochoros' case, the ground had been laid for putting Palamas beyond any further criticism. Philotheos presided over the council and was also Prochoros' chief interrogator. First, he invited the defendant to make his case. Prochoros asked for his books to be produced and challenged anyone who wished to contradict what was said in them to come forward, and he would resolve any difficulties for them. Philotheos responded that it was not for Prochoros to teach the assembled bishops, especially if he was aligning himself with Barlaam. Whether or not he was following Barlaam's lead needed to be established first. Prochoros' books were therefore produced and read as he had requested. When the synod anathematized them, however, he was clearly stung by their repudiation. So confident was he that these theses were unassailable. Then, as in previous councils, the debate came to focus on the correct exegesis of the Transfiguration. Philotheos interrogated Prochoros closely on the nature of the divine light. Prochoros argued that it was both created and uncreated on account of Christ's dual nature. This allowed Philotheos to prove that such an opinion was incompatible with belief in the hypostatic union of the natures. The radiance seen on Mount Tabor was the radiance and illumination of the tri-hypostatic deity, not the flesh. It did not originate from the created flesh of Christ, but shone through it, which is why the face of Christ and the words of the gospel shone like the sun. Prochoros' interpretation was incompatible with the decree of the Sixth Ecumenical Council on the relationship between the human and divine natures of Christ. It was not simply his flouting of the injunction of the Synodal Thomas of 1351, forbidding criticism of Palamas, but more importantly, his Christological error, which made his offense worse than that of Barlaam and Akindynos, that ensured his condemnation. Prochoros, to his brother's fury and dismay, was deposed from the priesthood and excommunicated. He was not subject to imprisonment or exile, but lived quietly in Constantinople and died about a year later." End quote. So that gives an overview of basically the opponents of the Orthodox position of the Palamites, and it goes over in great detail the Orthodox position in this book, and I basically just kind of covered their opponents in this talk. But I have probably many more videos coming from this book, so stay tuned and subscribe if you haven't and like this content. Most of the content that I put out is actually on Orthodox theology, and every once in a while I'll put out a video on maybe gear reviews or like lens tests and stuff like that, just because I'm getting into photography and videography, cinematography and stuff like that because of having to do these videos. So most of my stuff is going to be on theology and books like this. So until next time, and until I do some more videos on this book, this is James signing out.